everyone, and welcome back to Kitten Lady and Friends, my interview series where I'm talking to some of the most fascinating experts in cat welfare about how all of us can make it a safer and more compassionate world for cats. I'm sad to say this is my last episode of the series, but it's been so fun to have 8 episodes with some of my favorite advocates. I hope that you guys have enjoyed watching as much as I've enjoyed having these conversations. I want to again express my gratitude to Royal Canin for partnering with me on this educational series. I'm very grateful for their commitment to cat welfare, so thank you again, Royal Canin. Let's pull up the kitten cam because I've got some really cute stuff happening here today. This is my mama cat and her 5 babies, and looks like everybody's taking a nap, so we'll be able to check in on the kitten cam throughout. But I have to say, you guys, I'm really excited for this conversation. This is a conversation I saved for last because it's a very big picture conversation. We're going to be talking all about the future of animal sheltering with 2 of the most incredible advocates out there. So I'm going to be joined today by Dr. Julie Levy. She is a professor of shelter medicine at the University of Florida. She's also the co-founder of Million Cat Challenge and the co-founder of Maddie's Shelter Medicine program at the College of Veterinary Medicine. She's also the founder of Operation Catnip, a nonprofit that has spayed and neutered more than 55,000 cats in Gainesville, Florida since 1998. Her research has been hugely important to the work that I do and that all of us in cat welfare do. I'm so grateful to have her here. I'm also joined today by Kristen Hassen. She is the director of Pima Animal Care Center in Arizona. She is a leader in the Human Animal Support Services Initiative, and she's on the board of directors for the National Animal Care and Control Association. She's doing amazing, progressive work in her shelter, and she's truly a thought leader in the animal sheltering industry. So I'm very grateful to have both of them with me today. Dr. Julie and Kristen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you guys. So before we do a deep dive into kind of the present day and future of sheltering, I kind of want to take a look at the past. I think it's important for us to understand and know our history. And Kristen, you sent this incredible photo to me. It's like this black and white image of a shelter drop box. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk to me about the history of animal sheltering and also the history of your experience. Like when you first got started, what was it like?
Yeah, so this picture actually comes from the shelter where I work now, Pima Animal Care Center in Tucson, Arizona. And we know it's sometime in the late 50s, but we're not exactly sure what year. And it was a drop box where cats were put on the top, and right underneath them, with just a screen separating them, were dogs. And it is sort of unimaginable now that we could do such a thing, especially to the cats that were probably just terrorized in this situation. But animal welfare up until the last 20, 25 years was really still based in this pound model. And the pound model was built in the mid 1800s to late 1800s. And it was really designed to take in nuisance dogs off of the street. It really was, the system was never built to serve cats. And when it did eventually incorporate cats, it was really just to round them up and kill them. And so I have been working in this field since '99. My first job was at a shelter where the euthanasia rate was around 85 to 90%. And my main job was identifying animals for euthanasia and then assisting with that, along with taking animal control calls. And it was devastating as someone that had gotten into the work because I loved animals. And cats in particular were really vulnerable unless a cat was under 2 years old, ran up to the front of the cage and was rubbing on you and out openly friendly, that cat got a big red E marked on its kennel, and it would be euthanized by the end of the day. And to think how far we've come in the time that I've been involved in animal welfare, it's just humbling and inspiring, and it tells us how much further that we could go.
I am just like, I have goosebumps and want to cry, and just it's you've been involved in this for twice as long or more than I have. And even for me, I've seen so much change in the last decade. I think you're absolutely right that it's pretty incredible to see how far we've come. I want to talk, Dr. Julie, to you about your early experiences, because you have been involved in cat welfare since before I was born. You have really been doing some incredible, groundbreaking work in this industry. And this is a photo, I think you said from 1986. I was born in 87, so you've been like a kitten lady since before I existed. So I want to first thank you for that. And I want to ask you, like, what was it like for you in the 80s doing this work? What did animal sheltering look like back then?
My beginning of work in animal welfare was similarly traumatic as Kristen's was. Is I was a veterinary student from 1985 to 1989, and the UC Davis campus is an ag campus, so they've got dairies and a lot of open space, and there were always a lot of cats on campus, but they were managed as vermin. Literally, the campus pest control would trap the cats for euthanasia or would distribute poison for the cats. And so that was pretty shocking as this excited young veterinary student coming to fulfill this lifelong dream of becoming a veterinarian. And we, as students, said, like, maybe we should just neuter these cats instead. Like, wouldn't that work? And you do have to remember, Hannah, I'm sure you can't remember, there wasn't an internet then. And so we were totally isolated, and people were kind of inventing TNR programs on the fly, but alone. It just seemed like a natural response to a problem. But we weren't connected or assisted in any way, so we all made the same mistakes. So I can remember running around the dairy. The cows were milked at 1 a.m. and all the cats would come out, and so we were chasing them with towels, trying to catch these poor feral cats. And then we finally learned there were traps, which made everything so much safer and more fun for all of us. I do have to give a lot of credit to the faculty there in the late 1980s. They gave us pretty full reign to develop this concept with the students, where we were trapping cats and bringing them into the teaching hospital, and they were supporting us by letting us do the spay and neuters. There was very far-sighted and trusting of the students. It's been just an incredible journey ever since, because that was a completely successful program. We were able to replace the pest control approach with a TNR program, and it still exists today. That article that you see was as part of the program. We would discover orphan kittens, or sometimes we probably made orphan kittens, which Hannah is teaching us how to avoid making orphan kittens. And we were raising them in the teaching hospital. The students were taking them home, and the faculty actually let us bring the kittens to class and feed them during the day. And it also provided a great opportunity to study fading kitten syndrome, why kittens were dying before they were weaned, and to develop some interventions to save more kittens that are used today.
Wow. Well, obviously you have done incredible pioneering work. I love the thought of like you out there with a towel trying to catch a cat in the 80s. Oh my gosh. One of the ways that shelters are most like visibly to the public changing is that the housing in shelters has changed a lot over the years. And I know, when people think about, what an animal shelter looks like, they picture kind of these like stacked kennels and cages for cats. And of course, there are still kennels and cages in animal shelters, but there's been a real shift in recent years towards having more like open format rooms, things like that. Kristen, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about like how the housing for animal shelters and cats in shelters has changed. I know that you have, some more like open format and cohort housing in your shelter. Can you talk about what that's like?
The old days of these teeny tiny kennels, and in fact, when I got to PAC, we were still in the 1960s version of the facility, and the kennels were just almost unimaginably small. The cats could go from their litter box to a tiny little spot where they could lay. And in a lot of shelters, even still today, the cats don't have any bedding or boxes or hidey holes. And when the new PAC facility was built, they built it with a whole new concept in mind. Like at our shelter, like so many cats they were just an add-on. The shelter wasn't built for them. And so when I got to PAC, the cats were in this old side room and they were surrounded by dog kennels. And it was to the point that the cats were so frightened that it wasn't infrequent that cats would die because they were just so terrified and they wouldn't eat. And a couple of days of that, and they would immediately be in distress. So when they built a new facility, the cat advocates in our community felt really strongly that we needed a facility that was built with cats in mind as much as dogs. And so what that means for us is that all of our kennels are large portaled kennels, the litter box is on one side. Every kennel has shelves. And then the portals can be opened up so the kennels can be made even bigger when we're not at capacity. In addition, one thing that we found that's really important is we have 9 group rooms for cats. These can house any number of cats. It really depends on the situation they come from. And we started housing all of our hoarding cats together, and it just changed everything for us. So this is an example. This is one of the hoarding cases that came in. In the old days, we would have separated all of these cats. They would have all gotten an individual kennel, and the stress level on them would have been just immense. And so this is how we house the cats that come from hoarding cases now. And you can walk in a day after cats have come into a hoarding case and they all come up and greet you. And they're like, hey, we really like all this food that you're giving us. So it's just a totally different way of thinking about cats. And I think we've really gone from, Dr. Levy mentioned that cats are really treated as nuisance animals, almost sort of as wildlife, but even less cared for. And now every single cat is an individual, and we really try to think about, okay, if we were a cat, what would help us through this situation? And we're always trying to think about the things from the perspective of the cats. And that means that no cat is in a kennel for more than about a week unless that cat prefers that environment to a group room.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love seeing all of these cats thriving and feeling comfortable. And I think when they're in these group rooms, it's also a great opportunity for people to kind of be able to picture what it would be like to have that cat in their home. Now, Dr. Julie, obviously, we talked a bit about portals here, and I know that's something you're really passionate about. I want you to tell me all about Portal Mania. And for anybody who's watching who doesn't know what a portal is, can you talk about what's a portal, why are they important, and tell me about Portal Mania?
So there's lots of old shelters that were built with these very small metal boxes, essentially the size of a cat, a little bigger. And it was just thought because cats were quiet and not that active and they fit quietly in these small boxes that was adequate housing. And so there are many, many shelters that today have this old housing, and they can't afford to rip it all out and build brand new housing. So the team at UC Davis was so brilliant. They learned how to cut holes between 2 cages and install these portals that you see here. And that essentially creates a suite for the cat. And so now the cat litter box can be on one side and the food in the bed, hiding box can be on the other side, and cats have choice. They can get some exercise moving between the 2 sections. It also allows for the staff to close the little portal door and clean one side of the cage, and then they can open it up and shoo the cat to the other side of the cage and clean it. So that way they're not taking the cat out of the cage to clean and cross-contaminating it in a box or stressing the cat out. We know now that stress is by far the biggest contributor to upper respiratory infections in cats in shelters that are very, very common. And the less we have to handle cats and move them from one container to another, there's a direct relationship to protecting their health. So these portals have really been a very simple solution to a complex problem and have changed the health and welfare of cats in shelters that have this old style housing. And so there's, you can buy these portals now, all made. We used to have to make them out of PVC pipe that we sliced up into rings, but people don't have to do that anymore. They can order them online. And so we developed this year Portal Mania. It was a campaign to take advantage of the lower number of cats that were being housed in shelters due to the COVID pandemic. So when the COVID pandemic broke out and organizations reverted to emergency services only, there was a mass exodus of cats and dogs from shelters into foster homes and adoption. And that really meant that shelters were largely empty for a moment. And it was the perfect time to rehab all this cat housing by putting portals in it. So we did a fundraising campaign and raised a lot of money from a great number of industry donors. And we invited shelters to apply for free portals. And we got a match from the company that sells the portals. And so they were all discounted to us. And we were able to distribute over 3,500 portals to shelters. And they are all being installed like right now. And we're just getting all of this great love back from the shelters that are installing them and noticing how happy their cats are and how much easier it is to care for them.
Yeah, I think we have a video of one of the cats like running around so happy. It's awesome. So you can see here like the big difference that's made even in a kennel. The cat has ability to go up. They have the ability to go side to side. They have a lot more space, distance from their litter box. I love portals, and I think Portal Mania is so cool. What a great idea. Kristen, you talked about how, at your shelter, you actually consider shelter housing to be kind of the second best thing, and that keeping animals in the community through foster care and programs like that should always come first. I really loved that concept that like a shelter should be kind of the second place that you would want the animal to be, but the community comes first. And I have this video that I want us to watch because I literally was sitting here crying when I watched it. So I want to watch this video about a really unique foster program that you started, and then we'll talk about the impact that that's making in your community. But let's watch this video.
The kitten foster program has exceeded our wildest expectations. When we began this program, we were inundated with kittens. Our shelter takes in about 10,000 cats and kittens every year. And kittens are one of the most vulnerable populations we have in shelters. They need round-the-clock care, and so we were looking for places to put kittens. And we found a partnership with a memory care facility, and it seemed like a natural fit.
Want to see what I got?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Look at that.
How cute.
Look at that.
How
It's a
cute.
kitty.
We started this program because we were trying to save kittens' lives. But what's so exciting is that we've been able to bring so much joy and happiness to the residents' lives. There's nothing more fun than watching kittens play and bounce around and watching them grow up. And so we've gotten to bring all of that joy that we experience every day seeing the kittens to residents in these facilities. Many supplies are needed for the kittens, including bottles, formula, medications. They also need housing, so we're able to buy the pens that they live in, litter boxes and litter. All of these things we send with the kittens to the memory care facilities. The way that our program works is it's truly a partnership between the memory care facilities and the shelter staff. And that means that a staff person is involved in every step of the process, from selecting the kittens, dropping them off, and helping counsel the memory care facility on how to take care of the kittens.
May I give a little gray kitten to someone?
So the Petco Foundation's Innovation Showdown investment provides staffing and supplies for the program. And the other thing that we want to do this year is help teach other shelters how to do this program, because the life-saving benefits and the possibility of engaging our communities in entirely new ways are so amazing. Since this investment, we've received inquiries from all over the country asking us about how we're doing this kitten foster program and how other shelters can do it as well. And for us, that's the goal, is to help spread this great idea to the rest of the nation.
I'll love you anytime, anywhere.
Oh my gosh, where's my tissues? It's just awesome. So cool. Can you talk, Kristen, about like the importance of these foster programs and these community programs that help animals not need that on-site housing?
Yeah, so this program was started actually under the tenure of the previous director, Jose Ocaño. And at the time that he started it, PAC was it was still in the old facility and it wasn't set up for kittens. And that meant that we were literally storing kittens in old broom closets. We were putting kittens in these rooms that were never meant to house animals because they didn't want to euthanize for space. But the conditions were not good. And so this program started at a time when the space was really needed, and they weren't even thinking really about the people. They were just thinking about saving lives. And what kind of shocked everyone about that program was that these folks would have not had a lucid memory in 5-10 years, and their loved ones were there with them every day, every week. And to see one of these people who had lost their memory hold a kitten and start to recall their childhood and start to talk about growing up on a farm for the family members was really life-changing and just so moving. And it sort of sparked a different way of thinking about cats and kittens in our shelter. And since then, we have 4 foster coordinators, and one of them is dedicated entirely to adult cats. And the reason for this is that we have 2 foster coordinators who focus on kittens and other young animals. But for adult cats, they aren't always as easy to get out. And they were the ones that were really sitting in our shelter for a long time. So since then, we now place half of our cats into foster homes. About 2,600 of our almost 6,000 cats went to foster homes last year. So fosters become the primary way of housing cats, and they only stay in the shelter while we're trying to seek foster placement or adoptive placement, and they are all eligible. So everybody, the goal is that they are there as short a time as possible and they're in a home as quickly as possible. And by doing this, we've been able to reduce the length of stay. We used to have cats that would be in the shelter for 8 or 9 months. That's just not a reality any longer. The vast majority of our cats are out into a home within 10 days.
That's so incredible. Yeah, I think it's like, on the one hand, the animals are getting more visibility in the community. On the other hand, they're happier. They're cats who are in foster homes make great candidates for adoption because they're going from one home into another. And I'm such a huge advocate for fostering. I, think right now is an incredible moment for fostering because a lot more people are finding that maybe it could fit their lifestyle. So just saying, for anybody watching, if you're not fostering yet, now's a great time to start. I always say that, the populations I've chosen to focus on are those who I feel are really the most at risk, which is like those neonatal kittens, but also feral and community cats, which I want to talk to you about, Dr. Julie. That's another really big population that has traditionally been at risk in shelters, and you have been at the forefront of changing that. I would love if you could talk a little bit about your program, Operation Catnip. What do I have this number right? Is it 55,000, 65,000? How many? You're like doing an incredible amount of spays and neuters. So talk to me about Operation Catnip and kind of the history there. This is an amazing video, by the way.
This is a great video to show what we do. So we are very fortunate to have this surgery space at the veterinary school, and we can we borrow it once a month on the weekend and turn it into a large clinic that can spay and neuter over 200 community cats for local residents in a single day. It's staffed entirely by volunteer veterinarians and veterinary students and cat lovers. They come in the morning and they pick up their cats and traps in the afternoon. We also have about 800 traps that we loan out to the public to support this. So this is truly a partnership between the public, our nonprofit TNR program, and the College of Veterinary Medicine. In addition to the fact that we have spayed and neutered over 65,000 cats, and that has resulted in plummeting intake in our local shelters. We used to euthanize thousands of cats in our local shelters, and now it's down to a few hundred, all of which are euthanized for humane reasons, for untreatable medical conditions. But we also train veterinary students to carry out these programs in the future. And when they disperse across the country in their new job, they can spread all of this great work.
That's amazing. I have to imagine this does make such an impact in the entire, county that you're in. Can you talk a little bit about the impact this makes for, your community and other communities? Like, is this something that you think every community should have? And what impact does that make on animal shelters when there are these high volume, high quality spay-neuter options for community cats?
Yeah, there's no doubt that every community needs to have a TNR program. There are a large number of cats we call community cats, which are the stray and feral cats that live in neighborhoods. They're not owned in the traditional sense, but usually they have made friends with somebody in the community that is offering some food, or they've identified a food source of their own. They live and thrive in neighborhoods, and our job to control their numbers and to provide for their welfare, as well as to mitigate any nuisances or negative impacts they have, is to spay and neuter them and provide them with vaccinations, and then keep an eye out for their condition. So if they ever do get injured or sick, we can provide care for them on an ongoing basis as well. So the TNR programs that are not necessarily associated with the shelters are absolutely essential in every community. Shelters can take this to the next level by identifying community cats that come in, that are brought in by the public or are picked up by their officers for neutering and returning to the neighborhood. And that's really the same as TNR. We call it return to field or return to neighborhood. As far as the cat's concerned, it's exactly the same thing. Someone picks them up, they go get neutered, they get their ear tipped for identification, and then they end up back in their home in the neighborhood. From the administrative point of view, one is TNR is directly the original intent. Someone traps a cat because they intend to bring it back, whereas return to field is almost the same, but it's the shelter doing it. So the shelter has taken in a cat that they determine the best outcome is to go back to its neighborhood. A great benefit of these programs is that it also gets lost cats back to their home. So we know that shelters have a very low rate of returning lost cats to their owners. It's only about 2% nationally, whereas dogs are 10 times or more higher. And these programs that return cats to the neighborhood, they actually increase the chances of a lost cat coming home by 13 times. So people are 13 times more likely to find their lost cat in the neighborhood through a TNR program than they are by going to a shelter.
Wow. Well, thank you for all of that. I want to pull up my cat cam here because this is just a great example. The kittens and the mom that are on my cam come from a similar situation. You can actually, if she turns her head at all, you'll see she actually has an ear tip. She was trapped and spayed and she went into the clinic, was spayed. She was ear tipped to identify that she's been through the program. And then we were able to reunite her with her babies afterwards. And this has just been a joy caring for her, even though she's not my biggest fan. She's very feral. I know she can't wait to go back to her community, to the home that she knows. But, there's so much room for us to grow as an industry still, I think, in kind of awareness and programs that serve these community cats. So I really appreciate all of your work there. I want to move towards talking about intake reduction. And Kristen, I'd love to talk to you about sort of the philosophical shift that's been occurring over recent years in animal sheltering, because, that photo that you showed where it's like people could literally just come drop off a kitten in a drop box. That's kind of an old way of thinking. And there's now this kind of model of thinking about maybe not every cat needs to come into the shelter. Maybe there are other things that we can be doing to kind of keep animals from ever entering the shelter to begin with. Can you talk about that philosophical shift and what are some of the programs that help to reduce intake in shelters?
Yeah, so for people that don't live in a part of the US where overcrowding in shelters is still a reality, it can be a little hard to make this leap because they're like, they have empty kennels, just take the cats in. And so I think that it's important to point out that there is some geographic variability in need. I worked in Fairfax, Virginia, where we didn't really see a tremendously high number of cats coming into the system. And now I work in a community where I was saying earlier today when we were talking that we have about 20 potential hoarding cat houses that we're working. Animals are breeding several more times a year. And so people have more animals. Our shelter takes in about 20,000 animals a year. And so we can quickly get into a situation where what we're doing is we're rounding up cats, we're putting them in the shelter, and they're coming into these overcrowded situations where they're getting diseases, some of which are deadly. They're having behavioral decline because they're just so stinking scared. And they become unadoptable for one reason or another. And we can run the risk of bringing animals in, giving them conditions that prove fatal, and then euthanizing them. And so we had to make a shift. And TNR was a huge part of that. And SNR, which is bringing when healthy, friendly stray cats come in, spaying and neutering them and returning them to their community. But we also had to start looking at the other reasons cats are coming in. A lot of cats come in as strays. The reclaim rate, if a cat comes into the shelter, is something like 2% nationally. In our shelter, it's actually 1%, which is really abysmal. It means once we remove cats from their neighborhood, they're not going home. And so we then started to look at owner surrenders and why people were bringing in their cats, and started to think about diversion strategies for those as well. So what our goal is now as a large municipal agency is to say what cats need to be here and what cats don't. And this is not a binary black or white decision-making process. It is case by case, cat by cat. And so we try to look at every single animal, evaluate its particular needs, and then decide if the shelter is the best place. And in many cases it is. In many cases it's not. And so we do our best to keep those healthy cats in the community where they're more likely to get home, and they will do just fine. And I think for us, what that's meant is that we don't see widespread calicivirus. We don't see widespread pan-Luc in our shelter. And every single cat in our care is getting what it needs to get out. A few years ago, just maybe 3 years ago, any cat that had diabetes, renal failure, any chronic but manageable condition was generally just euthanized because we were so overwhelmed with volume that we could only keep the healthier ones alive. And today that looks totally different. We're able to treat virtually every single medical condition a cat can have, including things like incontinence, which are really challenging. And we do that through a combination of deferring the cats that don't need to be there and then using foster and rescue partners for the cats that do. The last thing I want to say is that municipal shelters that do this have to get creative. Since COVID, a lot of our rescue partners are taking direct cat intake, something they hadn't done before. Before, come through the shelter's the middle agency, then they go to rescue. Now they're taking them directly. And so what we're doing to thank them is we're getting those cats spayed and neutered. And that is a benefit to everyone because what it means is then they can take more cats and we can keep the system moving. So I think that whenever we talk about how to manage cats, we always talk about it as if it's if this, then not that, but it's actually both and so we've assembled a big giant cat toolkit, and the ultimate goal is that we want to achieve live outcomes for every cat possible and achieve the best live outcomes for them.
You know, another thing that you had mentioned to me that I loved was with your microchip and vaccine clinics. I know that, you can kind of see dogs lining up for these clinics, but a lot of people don't want to, bring their cat into a line like this. And you talked about doing something very creative so that it's more accessible for cats, so that cats receive the care they need without, having to stand in a line like this. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we were never very successful. We do tons of outreach, microchip, vaccine clinics. We were never very successful about getting cats there. And I think we had assumptions about that. I think we thought people didn't value their cats as much, or they didn't care about identifying them, and really hadn't thought about it. And then we about a year ago, decided to do our first drive-up microchip clinic. And the idea was that it's very hot in Tucson, and making people stand in line with their pets can be dangerous. And so this was a way to do the clinic without having that. And we were really surprised that something like 3 times the usual number of cats showed up, and it went up from there. We started seeing nearly as many cats as dogs coming, and we realized it's because pet owners feel a lot safer bringing their cat in a vehicle. There's not the perception that they could escape. And we were able to get a ton of cats vaccinated and have been able to since. And that program has now been replicated around the country with similar results.
I love that. It's very creative, and I think we have to be creative to increase access to veterinary care for cats, because it is such a issue, the cats, not receiving the same amount of veterinary care as dogs. So I really give you a lot of props for that program. I love that. Dr. Julie, you are the co-founder of Million Cat Challenge, and you're doing amazing work with shelters all over the country. I'd love if you can talk a little bit about your goals with Million Cat Challenge, and specifically something I love that you guys talk about is this super highway, which I'd love if you could explain what the super highway is and how are you helping shelters save the lives of cats.
Yeah, this is a great picture of Dr. Kate Hurley from UC Davis Shelter Medicine Program and me. We're locked in a house in Aptos, California on a research retreat. And we have spent a week making little sticky notes and charts and graphs to decide what the best ways we could help shelters save more cats. The goal of the Million Cat Challenge was to enroll shelters across North America to save 1 million more cats over 5 years. So this is above the baseline cat life saving that they were already doing. And we had, during our years of consulting for shelters, had come across a repeating pattern of certain techniques that shelters were using that always worked. And we narrowed this down to 5 initiatives that any shelter could do that was of any size, rural or urban, municipal or nonprofit, wealthy or not. And we set up a website, we created outreach, and we invited shelters to join. There was the only commitment they had to make to join the Million Cat Challenge was to save at least 1 more cat than they did the year before. And then we provided a lot of education and opportunity to adopt 1 or more of the 5 initiatives. And what's really exciting is that started in 2014, and the 5 initiatives have held up really well and are what are expanding now with this new COVID-inspired change, this reimagining of shelters to reduce the need to bring animals into a building and instead care for them in the community where they belong. So it involves safety net programs to keep cats out of shelters in the first place, improving the quality of care and the housing they get while they're in the shelter and reducing the amount of time they need to be in a shelter, and then removing self-imposed barriers on positive outcomes for shelter cats. So really opening up to adoption and implementing wider spread return to field programs.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I know that a lot is changing in the way that shelters think about both intake and outcomes. And Kristen, you mentioned about diabetic cats and the ability to increase, kind of widen the circle of who we consider to be adoptable. I can tell you that's, I work a lot with cats and kittens who, many years ago would not have been considered adoptable. Kittens who, have congenital differences. There's a lot of things that there's James. James is one of my recent kittens who, he has no back limbs, but I consider this to be a highly adoptable cat, and he got his great, wonderful home. So I wanted to ask you about how we are widening the circle of who's considered adoptable, whether that's, having FIV, congenital differences, leukemia, you have ringworm cats available for adoption. I'd love to hear kind of your experiences with, adopting out cats who have ringworm, who have upper respiratory infections, who have, these things that maybe previously were considered to make them not candidates for adoption.
Yeah, so to talk about that, I just want to go back a little bit to the Asilomar Accords, which was a convening, which I was not part of or working in animal welfare at the time, but it was a convening of experts trying to determine what life saving should look like in communities and how we should count the numbers of animals. And as part of the Asilomar Accords, there was this category of animal that was called untreatable or unhealthy. And that category differed community by community. So the idea was that each community would decide what was unhealthy and what was untreatable. And it really varied. In some communities, ringworm was certainly considered untreatable or unmanageable. It was unmanageable, untreatable, I think. And Dr. Levy, correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong. But and so it could have been ringworm. It could be diabetes. It could just be a very simple upper respiratory infection. So the reason that's important is because what it meant is that for years and years, if communities were using these, an animal would have a condition and it was an automatic death sentence for that animal. And thank goodness that is all completely changing in many cities and communities around the country. And so now there's a lot more questions asked. I think Dr. Levy's work on FELV and the work of Austin Pets Live on FELV is a great example of sort of questioning, but do they really need to die? And now we look at every animal and we look for a live outcome option. We don't think, is this a criteria for death? But our industry still really needs to get rid of that thinking. So we've thrown that out the window. We don't have, quote, criteria for death in that way anymore. And so our aim is to save every cat. The ones that are still hard to save fall into a few categories. We do, as an open admission shelter, take in cats that are extremely sick and injured. Sometimes they truly are untreatable, but everything else gets a chance. And how that's played out, the last picture you showed was our ringworm ward. Our ringworm ward used to be in the very back of the shelter, hidden away, and the kittens would just sit there for weeks and weeks and weeks while they got their lime sulfur dip. A couple of years ago, we moved that ringworm treatment ward to the front of the shelter. It has its own row, but it's publicly accessible. It's called the Fungal Jungle. And now all of our ringworm cats and kittens are publicly on view, and we just tell people the rules. Don't grab them and rub your face. And we let them know what the rules are. And what's been really fascinating is that they're flying out the door as quickly as others. We give people the treatment. We tell them the protocol on how to complete their treatment. And those kittens are often so highly adoptable that as soon as our non-ringworm kittens are gone, those guys are gone too. And we typically, when this picture was taken, we typically in an earlier year would have had 20 to 40 ringworm kittens, and our census is 0 or stays very, very low now because they get adopted or fostered as quickly as our other cats and kittens.
That's so awesome. I love that you give people like the opportunity to, if you want to do the treatment, like by all means, like please take them home. Ringworm is totally a treatable condition that anybody can learn how to do. So I think that's great. You also mentioned to me that you are passionate about some of the owner requested euthanasia cases that you get in. Can you talk a little bit about how you view outcomes for owner requested euthanasia cases?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me about this. It is something I'm really passionate about because there's a category of intake called owner-requested euthanasia, and it's used very, very differently depending on what shelter you're in. In some shelters, an owner can go in with a perfectly healthy animal and say that they would like to request euthanasia, and there are no questions asked. The animal is taken to the back. And what's really frightening about that is often those numbers aren't counted in shelter data. You won't see them counted with the live release rate. So a shelter can have a live release rate that appears to be 90%, but in reality is closer to 70% when you count the owner-requested euthanasia. So what's the real problem with that? Of course, it does happen that people bring us animals at the end of their lives, and those people don't have the means to pay $100, $200 or more to have the animal euthanized. The problem is that we have trained our communities to bring us animals when they can't afford medical treatment or care and to request euthanasia because we have never offered them any alternative. And so we find that we euthanize about 20% of the animals that are brought in when the owner says, I'd like this animal euthanized. And the next question you may say is, well, that's not fair. What if you're not going to abide by the owner's request? And what we say is we no longer provide on-demand euthanasia. We act in the best interest of the animal. And we let the people surrendering know that. And we have saved some of our just most amazing animals, our amazing cats that are in my memory. They were brought in as owner requests for euthanasia, and they didn't want to die. And we were able to get them homes, and many of them went on to live perfectly normal lives. But it is still a tragedy of our movement that we're not talking about this enough. And it's 800,000 animals a year. It's not a small number of animals. Many of those are cats. Feral cats are often brought in as owner requests for euthanasia, non-social cats. And we need to be talking a lot more about this because we will not have reached the life-saving that our nation hopes to achieve until we really address those animals. And they're dying invisibly too. Nobody knows about them. And that's the other part that kind of breaks my heart.
I am so glad that you mentioned that to me because I have to be honest, that's not a category that I think about very often. And I think it's so awesome and eye-opening that you're, making kind of like a bit of noise around that because it is something that I think shelters could start thinking about. Another population that I really want to talk about, you mentioned the research that Dr. Julie has done around leukemia, so I want to talk about that with you, Dr. Julie. Let's pull up some of your research, and I'd love for you to talk to me about kind of the way that awareness around feline leukemia is changing. What would you say to people who are trying to figure out their policies around adopting out a leukemia-positive cat? What does the research say?
This is another condition, like Kristen mentioned, where traditionally cats were just screened for FELV, and if they had a positive test result, they were euthanized. And it was for good intents. People worried about would they spread infection to other cats, or there were so many healthy cats already being euthanized in these large volume shelters that these ones were sort of triaged. And we've had some folks all along who challenge this idea. Like Kristen said, that most pets are savable with the right resources and the right education. And we've been just remarkably reinforced by the willingness of the public to take all kinds of cats on, whether they're old cats or whether they're these young cats with conditions like FELV. So this is a chart that we drew to try and explain how complicated testing for FELV is. And we've really longed for this to be something as simple as something we can test for at one point in time and then categorize a cat as being infected or not infected. But as we've looked at all the different ways we can test cats with a lot of different kinds of tests, the ones you do right in practice or the ones that you send away to the lab, or if you test cats on different days over time, we started to realize we were getting all kinds of different results and it wasn't consistent from time to time, which made us worry that we were making life and death decisions on tests that we weren't interpreting right. And it's not that the tests were wrong, but it's more about the biology of the virus in the cats. When cats become infected, if they have a really good immune response, they might completely eliminate the virus, or they might beat it down into this regressive state that we may or may not detect. Or if they have a poor immune response, it might be present at very high levels of the cat, and that's where we traditionally have thought of conditions that develop that cause early death and spreading it to other cats. And to make it even more complicated, we've shown in our research that cats can kind of shift between these two conditions. And so sometimes they might test negative, but they have a little bit of virus deep in their system. And if they get stressed, that virus may come out and test positive again. We were really fortunate to develop a research collaboration with Austin Pets Alive, which really upscaled FELV adoption programs. So they take in many hundreds of cats every year from shelters around the country into their adoption program. And so they had a lot of data to share with us, but also we worked together on a study in which we tested 131 cats monthly over time, and we're following those cats for the rest of their lives to see how they do. And that has been filling in some really important information for understanding what the best tests are to use. This chart here shows we looked at just the past 2 years of cats, 800 cats that were sent to Austin Pets Alive from around the country with a diagnosis of FELV. And the first thing you saw that is upon retesting, 20% of those cats didn't even have FELV. So the diagnosis was faulty in the first place. But then of the ones that we were able to confirm, the vast majority of those were adopted through their program. And only a small proportion needed to be euthanized or died in the program. We did another survey of these folks that adopted these cats and asked them what their satisfaction level was and would they do it again. And over 80% were very satisfied with having a positive cat and would do it again. So we really saw that people were adopting these cats, loving them, and not regretting it. We've now started spreading the word about this program and using it as a model to other shelters around the country, because it's not very scalable to say that all of the cats should go to Austin to be saved. Now that they've provided the sort of roadmap and toolkit on how to do it well, we're seeing these FELV adoption programs spring up all over the country really quickly now.
That's awesome. I mean, just thank you. All I can say is thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for sharing all of that. I want to ask Kristen a question about kind of, as we are opening more widely the circle of who is adoptable, it also means that we need more adopters, right? We have all of these cats who are adoptable. We need places for them to go. In the past, adoption has not always been the most accessible to every person, and there's this very big push in recent years to reduce barriers to adoption so that more people can accessibly go to the animal shelter and bring home a companion. Can you talk about the barriers that have kind of historically been in place in adoption programs and what it looks like to remove them?
Yeah, so I think when we think about adoption barriers, they've been a real sticking point. We've been talking for more than a decade. The ASPCA did so much to lead this conversation. The Humane Society of the United States. There have been best practices that say that we should make virtually everyone feel welcome to adopt for a decade. Yet we still see a prevalence of adoption restrictions. And the idea is that it is the job of shelters and rescuers to protect the animals from people. And I think I've been mulling over this so much lately, and I think a lot of it comes from the fact that many of us who do this work, we have trauma histories. We weren't protected at some point in our lives, and we do this work because we're able to protect animals in a way that we weren't protected. But that brings some deep emotional challenges to the work. And if we're not aware of that, it can lead to very restrictive policies, because somewhere deep in our kind of souls, in our being, we feel that we have to protect these animals and we can't take any risks. But we also, when you combine that with people's biases and their position, it's often privileged white women doing these adoptions, it leads to discriminatory policies. And I think we need to stop talking about adoption barriers and talk more about discriminatory adoption policies and really name it for what it is. And if it is, we work in a shelter where we welcome everybody. We turn some people away. There's some people that come that are they're obviously using a substance, or they appear that they are abusive to animals in front of us. There are people, or we've had an experience that says we're not willing to adopt them. Even as an open admission shelter, we do that. But we welcome everyone as if they have good intentions. And we start from that place. And we as a movement really need to start doing that, because we can't, what happens is you reduce your life-saving capacity when you are restricting adoptions that way. And rescues will say, well, we're here because shelters can't do the adoption screening we can do. And I think that is those rescue groups could be helping twice as many animals if they were less restrictive. And I've done this work now full time since 2012. I've been leading animal shelters, and I will tell you, I have never seen some of the worst adoption placements we've done have been ones when I worked in organizations that did intensive screening. I think that you can't predict. People's lives are precarious. We live in a time in the world where most of us are living paycheck to paycheck, or close to it. We cannot afford to be as judgmental as we have been, because it's going to lead to increasing euthanasia. And if we don't change something, I think we're going to have hit our life-saving peak as a nation, and we're going to backslide if we don't make a significant change, given all the challenges happening in the world right now. So I realize that's a lot, but it is a complicated and critically important subject.
Yeah, and I think that something I've seen a lot of people kind of throw out there is like, hey, as the person who works for your program, would you be eligible with all of the, would you meet the criteria? Because a lot of us in animal welfare, it's like, oh, actually, well, if you asked your landlord, could you get another cat? Would they say yes? I don't know. A lot of us in animal welfare might not even live up to the expectations that we've, traditionally had. So I think it is really important, a very important conversation. You mentioned these difficult moments that we're in right now, and I want to talk to Dr. Julie about that, because it seemed like at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone in the world, including me, was coming to you going, what do we do? What do we do? And you have played a huge role in kind of setting guidelines for how animal shelters and rescues and those of us who work with cats can be operating and continuing to do life-saving work during a pandemic. Can you talk about what that has been like? And, I guess what I want to know is, like, does this pandemic feel like a crisis to you, or does it feel like an opportunity, or like maybe both?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I can remember very vividly at the very end of February at the American Pets Alive conference. I'm a worrier. I'm very cat-like. I walk into any new situation kind of anxious and checking it out. And I've been watching kind of the international COVID story, and it was starting to sprout up in the U.S. And my work is in infectious disease epidemiology, and so I just had this sort of brewing panic about what was going to happen. I was already not shaking anybody's hand and opening doors with my elbow at the conference, and everybody thought I was kind of odd. But by the end of the conference, Kristen and Ellen Jefferson and the folks from Maddie's Fun, a few other national groups, we went out to the patio and had a glass of wine and just kind of talked about, should we be worried about this? Like, what could go wrong if this really does spread? And that very day, Kristen set up a Facebook group for shelter leadership that now has over 800 people in it. And we started having weekly calls and about what could happen, what we were watching happening with other industries. And we knew we had to move very fast and be very brave to define the role of animal sheltering in this country before someone else did it for us. And we had Kristen's with the National Animal Control Association and had a great voice there to come out early and say that animal sheltering is an essential service. Like, we need to be listed right there in all the emergency orders alongside hospitals and other essential services like police and fire. And we could not accept increased euthanasia as a way to cope with the coming staff shortages and other cutbacks that we're going to have. So very early on, NACA came out with a powerful statement establishing animal shelters as essential services, but also defining what we had to continue and what had to pause. So we had to continue the rescue of endangered and injured animals, people that needed help. But we also had to pause non-essential services like trapping cats and bringing them in, and volunteer programs and some other things that were kind of hard to pause at the time. In late February, nobody knew where this was going to go. I think we all felt like we were going to have to hunker down for a few months, but there was going to be a post-COVID era that we would spring back to after a few months. And what we see now, I think, is it's going to be a year or more of this COVID life. Maybe it will be forever. And we are all going
No.
through, I think there's a
Pray
lot
it
of
isn't
mental and
so.
physical exhaustion that people are coping with now because school's back in session and it's not like it was. Everybody's life is harder and more uncertain. And so so that's the downside. That's the panic that I have. The upside is it did cause us to pause, empty our shelters, and get animals into foster homes and adoptive homes. We asked the community for help and they responded in droves. We know the community is there and wants to help. And it created this pause where we could reconsider everything we traditionally do in animal shelters and ask ourselves, do we need to be doing this? Is it the best for the animals and for our community? And is there a better way we can do it? And that gave room for this human animal support services to be born and to a reimagining animal sheltering to serve people and animals and communities better.
Thank you so much for that. I know I saw these amazing photos of the Pima Animal Care Center that, Kristen, I want to talk to you about. At the beginning of the pandemic, you had like empty cages at your empty kennels at your shelter, and the photos are really, really amazing. I know that must have felt like overwhelming and also like an opportunity. And like, I want to know from you, like, how do you feel that we can take this moment that we're in, this opportunity of a shift in the way that people are thinking? How can we take this opportunity and run with it towards a better future for shelters?
Typically in the early summer, our shelter would have about 550 to 600 dogs and about 400 to 450 cats inside the shelter. And we run the nation's largest municipal foster pet program too. So we would have just as many animals in foster. The inventory in the summer can be over 2,000. This year, since COVID, the inventory has been between about 100 and 150 dogs and about 50 to 80 cats. And the animals are staying in their homes, neighborhoods, and communities because when COVID hit, we knew we were going to have to do things differently. And so right away, we pled all of our animals to foster because we were worried in the beginning of COVID, we'd have to shut our doors and the animals left inside could be euthanized. So we pled everyone to foster, and we sent 90% of our animals to foster homes at the beginning of COVID. And since then, we've really relied on foster care, and we were able to be part of a nationwide movement. And some of these pictures are from other shelters around the country where they emptied out virtually all of their kennels. And I think it was a learning moment for the movement because while foster care has been a program, I don't know that there's been a real belief that the community would really step up in the way that they did. And it showed us that it's possible. And at one point, the data from one of the shelter software companies showed that about 45% of the total U.S. inventory of shelter pets was living in foster. So it's a really new day because we're teaching ourselves what's possible, and we didn't quite believe it before. I worry that with the financial crises and the evictions, I mean, we've sort of kicked that down the road, but it's a reality. January or now, this eviction crisis is real. And the financial fallout from the millions and millions of unemployed people is real. And I worry that if we don't make fairly dramatic changes to the way that we operate as government-funded animal shelters, that we are going to find ourselves in a situation where we are going to be at risk of having to euthanize for space. So we started the Human Animal Support Services project, piloting it with more than 40 shelters around the US. And the goal of it is to just reimagine how we run animal shelters and to say it's time. We're long overdue. And we can't, if you think about if human social services, which is full of flaws, but if you think about what if they had not made the move to foster and to keeping kids in their homes and with family members, we would have a nation full of orphanages. And we don't. And we need to go there with animal welfare too. We need to take the best lessons from human welfare, even though it is also problematic, but we can learn from it. And we need to sort of take a One Health approach, thinking about people, animals, and the environment. And more than anything, the role of shelters should be to maintain and support the bond between humans and animals. We can't just keep rounding everything up and putting it in a building. It's not working anymore. It hasn't worked for a long time. And that is hitting us in the face during COVID.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. I guess I want to know from each of you maybe some final words of like advice or wisdom about where we want shelters to get to in the next 10 to 50 years. What is like your dream if you could look into the future and that's what you could see? What's your dream for the next 10 years? I'll start with you, Dr. Julie.
So that's such a great question, because I think all of us kind of ruminate on that, about how we would like it to be and what it would look like if all of our barriers were removed. And so I can imagine that the shelter serves more of a coordinating role to connecting people and their animals to the services that they need. So they can make veterinary care more accessible, so people don't have to relinquish their animals for because they can't access veterinary care, either because they can't afford it or it's just not nearby, or other access problems. I could see that there would be fewer community cats because our TNR programs were so robust and effective, and all of the community cats are getting the care that they need. And that shelters would be the place, the safety net for when everything else broke down and we couldn't provide care for an animal out in the home or the community that loved it, that there would be a place they could always go, and that they would coordinate things like emergency services if someone's had to evacuate their house for a house fire, or they were fleeing a domestic violence situation, that having their pet would never be a burden to them or prevent them from getting the services that they need, because we would take care of the pet or make sure that there was some way that the pet was safe as well.
That's beautiful. Kristen, anything you want to add about your dream for maybe specifically Pima Animal Care Center? What do you hope to see in 10 years?
So I think you're a really good example of where this movement needs to go. We have been so insular, and we have sort of suffered in silence, particularly government-funded shelters. And we've suffered in silence, and we've also told everyone to stay out of our business. And we need people like you to take charge and to engage people who want to help, teach them how to help. And I think that's the future. Like, I think the animal shelters are always going to be there. Animals can't speak, and there are always going to be animals that need to be in shelters, but our role should just be so much different. And we need to stop teaching our communities how to bring animals to us and do exactly what you're doing, which is teach them how to be part of the solution. So I'm so excited to be here and to get to talk to you, because I think what you've done is so remarkable and needs to be an example for people entering the field all over. Just take charge and fix the problem. We're not able to do it. Those of us running government shelters, we're not going to be able to do it. We need other solutions.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I think that, when people I always say, when you're looking for someone to help, remember you are someone, you are someone, and the community ought to feel more empowered to step up and help. And I love the work both of you are doing, because I think that you are putting the information out there that says, hey, shelters exist for this purpose, but let's try to make this a more community-based solution and give the people the tools they need to be able to be impactful in their communities. So I'm so grateful to both of you. I have only one last question, and my last question is always a would you rather question. So here is the would you rather question for you guys. Okay. Would you rather have $10 million to put towards any cat program that you wish, or would you rather have the power to spay or neuter any cat just by looking at them? And I will start with you, Dr. Julie. Which one would you rather have? $10 million to put towards any cat program, or the power to spay or neuter any cat with your laser eyes?
I'm going to take the $10 million because I think I can spay neuter all the cats with some of that $10 million and have some more $1 million left to do some of the other work. But the laser eye, that if that's an option too, I would consider it.
What about you, Kristen?
I think I'm going to take the 10 million as well because my heart is with old cats, and I think I would just invest it all into elderly cats who don't have a home anymore and start an old cat sanctuary.
All right. Well, if I ever find $10 million, I know who to call. But I hope you guys enjoy. I had a lot of fun making that one of the laser eyes. I wish that we could develop that power. And I'll also call both of you if we ever do develop the ability to neuter with laser vision. But thank you guys so much for your participation today and for all of the work that you're both doing. I'm really, really grateful for both of you. And I've just so enjoyed talking with you. So thank you very much for being here with me.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, guys. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, that was really, really fun. A great way to wrap up this 8-part interview series. If you have enjoyed watching this, but you missed a past episode, I have all of them available on my website. It's kittenlady.org/Kitten Lady and Friends. So you can go on there and watch the whole series. I want to thank everybody who participated, whether you watched or were interviewed. I also want to give a major thank you to Royal Canin. I could not have done any of this without their partnership, and I'm so grateful for them. I want to remind everybody, hop on royalcanin.com/cathealth. There is a whole initiative on there for the Take Your Cat to the Vet campaign. You can participate in a number of ways. There's an awesome cat to vet sweepstakes you can participate in. You can get a free chat with a veterinarian. So hop onto royalcanin.com/cathealth to check all of that out. And thank you guys so very much for staying curious, staying compassionate, and being here with me on Kitten Lady and Friends. Bye, guys.